Hello students, welcome to SuperKalam. I am your mentor Madhur and we are covering polity NCERTs in detail this week. Yesterday we completed class 11th NCERT of polity, which is Indian Constitution at Work. This is the first NCERT which we generally start, and it is perhaps the most important NCERT. So we have completed that. If some classes of yours are missing, I would advise that you complete those classes first. Now from today, we will start the second NCERT of class 11th itself, which is political theory. Now, political theory has a lot of chapters and two or three things which we should keep in mind while starting this NCERT. One first thing is this NCERT is very much optional driven. By optional driven, I mean that in this NCERT, PSIR related concepts are very widely covered. There are a lot of experts, philosophers, political scientists whose name is covered. That may not be important for you from GS perspective. So that you should understand first. Second is the concepts in this NCERT are very abstract and also very subjective. We will see throughout these two classes that the concept like liberty, how subjective it is, how its meaning evolves. We will also understand the same with justice. Justice has evolved through past decades, past few years, past centuries, like anything. So that's why you should be very much uh, tolerant and accessible to these new ideas, right? So that's why these two things you should keep in mind, and I will cover from the GS perspective this NCERT, and therefore we will try to cover these quickly because we'll not deep dive into optional level of understanding, and we will cover this NCERT in 2 days. That's our target. And other things remain usual. For example, I'll give you MCQs, I'll give you mains question as usual, so that your preparation, your application of knowledge remains good, right? So let's start with this class, the first class of political theory. Now, first essential thing is what is political theory? Now, not very important from the perspective of your GS, but because we are starting this chapter, so it becomes important to know about it. Now, political theory, there are two words here. First is theory. Now, theory is any generalized explanation of any concept, any phenomena. For example, there is theory of relativity, which explains the concept of relativity. So, theory is the explanation of a phenomena. Now, when we cover political theory, then political theory basically is a section, is a science, or uh, is a discipline wherein you study the political concepts. For example, what state is, how power in a state is exercised, what is the meaning of these values like liberty, fraternity, equality, what is the meaning of social justice, what is the meaning of justice, what are its dimensions, how the meaning of secularism evolves. So if this all concepts you study in a theorized manner, in a very scientific manner, then it is called political theory. So that's the first part which you should understand. The first set of concept which this NCERT start, the political theory of freedom. Freedom we will study in detail now. Now, if we study in very layman terms, what is freedom? Freedom means to be free to do anything, to be free to do anything. But its meaning is not that simple. First, its meaning has evolved. Different experts give different meaning. There are different dimensions of freedom, which we will see through NCERT itself. Now, as I told, the simple meaning of freedom is absence of any type of constraints. There is no external constraint on you, and you are able to do anything which you want. That is freedom in simple terms. However, absence of constraint is only one dimension of freedom. Freedom is also about having the ability to do something which you want. For example, there can be a situation. For example, there is a very poor person, very marginalized person. Now, he or she may not have external impediments, external constraints, but also his internal capacity was also not there to do something. For example, he is not well educated to work. All the external constraints are not there, but internally also he is not capable. So that's why freedom has two aspects, which is absence of external constraints and also the inbuilt ability, capacity to do something, to express oneself. This is these are the two aspects of freedom. Now, there are some sources of constraints also. Why? See, if everyone will be free, that means no one is free. For example, if I am free to do anything, then I may do anything. A criminal may do crime, and then he will say that he has freedom to do anything. That's why there are certain legal constitutional restrictions, constraints on freedom. But it is not so. Besides legal and constitutional constraints, there are also social constraints sometimes. Social constraints. For example, social inequality. Previously in the Varna system and today also in the caste-based system in very various rural areas, we see that an individual from marginalized section is constrained to do anything. Previously, they were constrained to draw water from well. Today also they are to some extent constrained to dine with people of so-called upper class. So that social constraint remains. So legal constraint or constitutional constraints are in a way fine because they helps us to widen the scope of freedom. But these social constraints which are there in the society, these economic constraints which are there in the society, a person who is from poor background, he may not be able to uh, give proper education to his children. So that is an economic constraint. So these constraints exist in our society. These are constraints which are there on freedom today. Now, as I told you, some constraints we need. The legal constraints we need because otherwise there will be chaos. For example, there are two persons. Beautiful examples are given in NCERT itself. For example, rage while driving on roads, fighting over parking space. If there will be no constraint, for example, one parking per person in a building, everyone will try to take that parking space for themselves and they will say that they have freedom to take that parking space. Similarly, if there is a disagreement regarding whether a particular film should be screened or not, now there are very controversial films which came. Now one side, the filmmakers will say they have freedom to show that film, but then there has to be some morality, some public order which that film should not disturb. So that's why some constraints are needed. Some constraints avoid chaos and promote cooperation, right? But it becomes important to identify that which constraints are fine, good, and which constraints are not. Social and economic constraints are bad here. Now, this is very subjective also. Now, there was one philosopher who basically tried to give explanation of which constraints should be good, which constraints should be there, and which constraints should not be there. So, it was given by John Stuart Mill, J.S. Mill, who gave the concept of harm principle. Now, this is very much related to PSIR, but here in your essay and ethics, you can use this concept. Now, what does harm principle mean? Harm principles means actions which may cause harm to other people. There should be constraints to those actions. For example, unnecessarily cutting the forests. Now, cutting the forest, one may say a business person can say he has a right to cut forest. He has a freedom to cut that forest. But if we go by harm principle, then we will see by cutting forest, one, you are basically impacting the shelter of tribals. Second, you are in a way contributed towards increasing pollution. And increasing pollution means you are harming others. So here the harm principle says that others are being harmed much in cutting forests. So cutting forests should have some restrictions, some constraints. That's why government has a lot of policies with respect to forest cutting. For example, there is CAMPA legislation, which you must be knowing. There are Forest Rights Act. So these laws provide some constraint that if you are cutting forest, you should keep a few things in mind. In the CAMPA legislation, you should plant more trees. In the Forest Rights Act, you should, while cutting forest or while managing forest, you should also consider the rights of tribals. So that's why these are constraints in line with harm principle, right? Now, in the initial, I told you about the two meanings of freedom. One is, or the two meanings of liberty. One is not having external constraints, and other is to have the capacity to do something. Now, this, in a very jargon tone, in a very jargon terms, can be classified as negative and positive liberty. Now, I will read it out. Two dimension of freedom school. Freedom as absence of external constraints and freedom as expansion of opportunities. Now, when freedom as a absence of external constraint, I see that means negative concept of freedom or negative liberty. When I say expansion of opportunities, that is the positive aspects of freedom, of positive liberty. So these are the two dimensions of liberty. So negative liberty seeks to define and defend an area in which individuals should be inviolable. That means negative liberty refers to those areas where there shouldn't be any external impediments, external constraints. And positive liberty is that area where there should be capacity building. For example, there should be schools. Why? Because without schools, without educate skills, you won't be able to incorporate capacity in an individual. And when there is no capacity, for example, if women or girls are not educated, they will not have a capacity to work, capacity to exercise their freedom. They will be under patriarchy only. That's why the positive liberty is needed in case of the women, right? So this is how you can connect it with real life examples also. Now, a very important freedom which we generally study, which is freedom of expression. Article 19 in Indian Constitution in particular talks about freedom of speech and expression. Now, as I told you the example of film, expressing yourself doesn't mean you are going against some basic norms. You are doing some immoral things. You are indecent things you are doing. It doesn't mean. That's why in Article 19 itself, we have a lot of reasonable restrictions which we completed when we were doing rights in the first NCERT. What are these restrictions? There are restrictions like security of the state shouldn't be compromised, sovereignty and integrity of India shouldn't be compromised. You should not incite an offense. Now, in the name of speech, free speech, if you are giving hate speech and you are basically inciting an offense, that shouldn't be done. That's why there are some justifiable constraints in our speech. That goes in line with freedom only, because freedom, some as I told you, some rational constraints should be there, but social and economic constraints shouldn't be there, right? So that's what freedom chapter talks about. So if I summarize, firstly, there are two concepts of freedom or liberty. What are these two concepts of freedom or liberty? One is positive liberty, other is negative liberty. In negative liberty, external constraints shouldn't be there. For example, if I want to do anything, any work, no constraint should be there. And in positive liberty, there should be capacity to do something. Inbuilt capacity should be there. I gave you the example of women here. Then we talked about various constraints. And constraints can be divided into two again. One is some valid constraints. Why? Because without those valid constraints, there will be chaos. For example, Article 19 related reasonable restrictions. Some are very invalid constraints, for example, social and economic constraints on any individual, on Dalit, on tribals, that because they are from a particular society, particular backward society, so they shouldn't be allowed to do particular type of business. So that constraint shouldn't be there because that undermines human dignity. Then we also talked about harm principle as in how these constraints which we discussed, how one can determine that which constraint should be there and which constraint should not be there. So if any constraint is there in order to avoid harm to others, that constraint is good. For example, the constraint of incitement of offense on freedom of speech is good because it saves us from harming others, from any rights. But a constraint of society or a constraint of a Varna system on an individual is not correct because it undermines the individual's dignity. So that's how harm principle works. Then we also at the end talked about the constraints, the justifiable constraints, especially in freedom of speech, Article 19. So this is the basic summary of your first chapter, right? I hope this is clear. Now we will move to other chapter. The next chapter is on equality. Now, if in simple terms we understand equality, what is it? It's given in NCERT. All human beings have an equal worth regardless of their color, gender, race, nationality. Everyone is equal. Everyone has to be treated equal as a human being. No further bifurcation should be there. Simple equality. However, this meaning of equality is very narrow. How it is narrow? Read this. The commitment to the ideal of equality does not imply elimination of all form of differences. See, equality doesn't mean that you eliminate differences between men and women, between Dalits or upper caste, for example, between a person from USA and a person from India. No, it merely suggests that the treatment we receive and opportunities we enjoy must not be predetermined by our birth or social circumstances. That means there can be certain like natural differences. For example, there are some natural physical differences between men and women, but that physical difference, that difference on birth, or that difference on social circumstances. For example, generally in our society, women are not treated like cognitively good, cognitively aligned with men. That is a social circumstance. So these birth-based and society-based differences should not limit the opportunities which a person gets. That's the meaning of equality. So equality doesn't mean that everyone has to be equal. No, there can be natural differences, but what a state, what a economy does to them has to be equal. There should be equality of opportunities, equality of treatment. Everyone should be considered equal, irrespective of certain differences if they are there. So that is the wide meaning of equality. Now, as I told you, equality of opportunities, irrespective of any identity, race, language, caste, class, gender, people should be there should be equality of opportunity. In our constitution also, Article 16 talks about this, that there should be equality of opportunities in public, equality of public employment specifically in Article 16 talks about. Now there are some natural and social inequalities. For example, if a person unfortunately is born with certain kind of disabilities, now that is a natural inequality. There is natural inequality because nature has done that. But on the basis of that inequality, if we treat that person in our society differently, we discriminate against that person in our society, then that is social inequality. Same goes with women. By birth, see, no one is in control of what child will be born. So if a person is born as a male or a female, that is a natural difference which nature has done. But if we use that natural difference as a way to create social difference, for example, women not being allowed to do jobs or women not being allowed to go freely in the society, that is the social difference, social inequality which we do. See, men are superior to women. It is a natural inequality. You can't do about it. I get more marks than you in every subject, and I also help my mother in household. What makes you superior? So basically, it talks about that only. If naturally we are saying that men are naturally born superior, that is a social conception, not a natural conception. That you should keep in mind. Now, three types of equality are talked about. One is political equality. Political equality means two aspects. One, every person, irrespective of any identity, class, gender, race, caste, etc., should be allowed to vote. Age gap can be there because age is a very different aspect, because it differentiates a child from adult. So age difference can be there, but voting rights cannot be curtailed on the basis of any identity. That is first political equality. Second is right to study in election, right to stand in election. Sorry, that is also a component of social political equality. In the same way, social equality means that in a society, every person has equal respect on the basis of some social hierarchies, on the basis of caste system or Varna system or religious differences. One shouldn't be segregated in employment. One shouldn't be segregated in education. One shouldn't be segregated while accessing certain kind of resources. So there shouldn't be that a particular well is only accessible, a particular mall is only accessible to a particular section. No, that is social inequality. That's why social equality is also very important. Next is economic equality. Now this is definitely very much huge in India itself. Inequality. Economic equality says that there should be equality of opportunities. Every person, irrespective of identity, should be equally accessible. He or she should have, you know, all types of means to practice a particular occupation. Economic equality also means that economic resources should be equally distributed. For example, if suppose is a mine, government is using that mine to generate resources. Now, it shouldn't be done that the benefits of that mines, the economic benefits of that mines are given to certain business class or certain section of people. No, the common man should also be given that benefits, especially the residents of that area. So that's why economic equality becomes important. And it is also said that economic equality is a first stage towards social equality. Because if you it is seen that most socially unequal persons from marginalized sections are also economically unequal. The 2011 census data itself says that The poverty among STs, OBCs, it is much more than this general class. So that's why this social inequality and economic inequality in India goes very much line in line. That we should understand. That's why to address it, we should work towards both sides. Economic equality, how? By giving educate opportunities, taxation, etc. And social equality, how? By laws, for example, abolition of untouchability, etc. So these both goes hand in hand. Now, how can we promote equality? What can be the ways? So there are 2 to 3 ways. First is establishing formal equality. In a formal way, you make everything equal. For example, from now on, no one will be treated unequally. That is one of the way. For example, from now on, a particular opening in a particular company is open for all, for women equally, for men, for Dalits, for upper caste, everyone. That is one of the way. But you should understand there are limitations to that way. Why? Because women or marginalized section may not be capable, they may not be well educated at the first place. So their starting line is different. How can you compare the uncomparables? That's when becomes important the equality through difference principle, differential treatment. Now our Article 16 also talks about it. Our Article 16 basically it doesn't believe in formal equality. Article 16 says that for women and for children there can be some special policies to promote equality. Reservation in metros is one case. In the same way, Article 16 also talks about reservation for socially and educationally backward classes. Now, reservation on the face of it will look like that it is differentiating some section from the other. So it may appear unequal, but this is done. Why? Because the starting point for everyone is different. The marginalized section needs some kind of push, some kind of hand holding, so that they come in alignment with the other sections of the other people's, other types of people. So that was the main belief, main idea behind this, behind creating equality by doing some certain kind of differences. That is the sense of constitution itself. Our constitution also allows it. And this affirmative action lies in that line only. Affirmative actions or positive discrimination, we can say, discriminating in favor of women, discriminating in favor of STs. That is affirmative action, which is basically a type of differential treatment in order to promote equality, right? So this was this chapter. Now, if we summarize this chapter on equality, we talked about meanings of equality. Equality in simple terms means equal treatment, but no. In wider terms, it should be towards handling all types of social inequalities. Natural inequalities can be there. The second part we read that natural inequalities can be there. For example, some Divyangjan, but it should not translate into social inequalities. That's the thing which we read about. Then we covered various types of equalities. We covered political equality, we covered social equality, we covered economic equality. And you will also find here that these are very much related. Generally, a person who is economically poor, unequal, socially also he is marginalized, and politically also he has very less say. Why? Because if he will not have resources in order to satisfy his basic needs, how can you assume that he will stand in an election? Right. So therefore, these are very much related. Then we talked about various ways in which this equality can be promoted. First was formal way in which everything you make equal, and other is through differential action. Like for marginalized section, you do something extra. Now, this is also the essence of Article 16. So this is your chapter on equality. Now we will move to next module. Now, after equality, we come to social justice. Now, social justice or justice in a specific sense, you should understand that justice is driven from a word called just or fair. So justice is inclined towards fairness. And see, these concepts of liberty, freedom, equality, justice, they are very much overlapped. You can create justice, you can create fairness through equality. For example, uh, reservation. Now, reservation is somewhat in a formal sense, somewhat an unequal system. But in a differential sense, as I told you in the previous chapter, in a differential sense, it is very essential system. Why? Because it will promote equality. So that difference principle, reservation, affirmative action can be treated as just, can be treated to have justice in the society. Why? Because there was injustice earlier, there was unfairness earlier. Not today, through reservation, we are creating fairness. So here you see that equality can be a way to achieve justice. That's why these all terms are very much correlated. In simple terms, justice is very much driven from our Hindu philosophy of dharma. So that is also one aspect to it. There are a lot of principles of justice. First principle is equal treatment for equals. Why it is considered just? Because from common sense perspective, if you see, if government law is treating equal persons as equal, that we will think that it is a just system. Why? Because there is no discrimination here, and government can be trusted here because it is treating everyone equal. So that can be the first principle of justice, treating everyone equal. Sometimes even treating everyone, some sections unequal can be a justice principle. Why? Because there are some special needs. There are special needs for Divyangjans. Now, if for Divyangjans there is a separate line, for women there is a separate line outside the bank. In one sense, it is unequal, but everyone will consider it just. Why? Because everyone will consider it fair. Why? Because it is there in order to meet the special needs of few sections. So that is other principle of justice. Another principle of justice is proportionate justice, means being in proportion. For example, this is very much used in criminal justice system. Our laws basically give punishment on the basis of proportionality of crime. If someone has done petty crimes, we generally put a fine or a very 1 or 2 year of punishment. But if someone has done heinous crime, murder, or any kind of violation against women, then in that case, the crime or the trials punishment can even go to hang till death, the capital punishment. So that's the proportionate justice. So therefore, there are many these concepts, many criteria of justice. One very famous criteria of justice, which we generally see, is no one can be a judge in his own case. Why? Because it violates the principle of equality. Because if I will be judge in my case only, I will be partial, and it will not be fair. So that is other concept of justice. So this chapter basically deals with this only majorly. And in our constitution also, if we see, we talks about three types of justice. We talks about economic justice, we talks about social justice, and we talks about political justice. Political justice is in alignment with political equality. Basically, politicians as well as political domain should treat everyone equally. There should be no religious discrimination, etc. Social justice, that means all those poor, all those marginalized should be given some additional benefits, additional treatment, so that they come in line with other sections of in the country. Economic justice means those who are contributing much are getting enough returns. It's not that there should be equality, but in terms of input, in terms of hard work, there can be equality, right? So this all comes in under justice, and this is given in our preamble also, and this is the basic essence of our constitution also. Now, this book gives you around the explanation of John Rawls' theory of justice. Now, John Rawls' theory of justice is in PSIR. We need not cover this in detail, but the one thing which John Rawls accepts is that there should be difference principle. That means difference principle means that you should recognize the differences, and you should basically handhold those elements who are marginalized. So John Rawls' theory of justice talks about three concepts of justice. First is everyone should be treated fair. Everyone should have educate equality, but educate opportunity. But he also says that those who are historically not capable, or those who cannot be brought near other people of the society through formal equality, should be treated in differential fashion. They should be given reservation, they should be given hand holding, for example. So John Rawls also talks about similar kind of concepts, right? So this is it. Justice, there has been a lot of debates with respect to justice also. So just to summarize, there are various conceptions of justice, concepts or principles of justice, which I told you. One is treating everyone equal, or rather taking equals as equals, treating equals as equals. Other can be proportionate justice, treating everyone in proportion to the crime. It can also be said that giving funds, giving salary to people in proportion to their work, that is also a part of proportional justice. So it is not just related to crimes. Other is special needs. Even if someone is not contributing much, but because there are some special needs, certain kind of disabilities, so we should treat him with uh, some more resources. So that is one more principle of justice. Now, these principles you can use in your ethics. So it's not just about polity, it's also about ethics. You can use these in ethics. Then we also talked about preamble. What does our preamble says about justice, social, economic, political justice? It talks about. And briefly, John Rawls also says the same thing, that people with special needs should have some special benefits, right? So this will be our chapter. Now this is how your book deals with the concept of freedom, concept of equality, and concept of justice. And you must have realized that their meaning is so different. Freedom, there are two meanings: positive freedom, positive liberty, negative liberty, and there can be also subjectiveness on the basis of constraints. Some may say that this constraint is good, some may say this constraint is not good. So this is very subjective, this is evolving. In the same way, equality also. We talked about a formal sense of equality, then we talk about differential sense of equality. This is also evolving. Previously, there has to be focus on formal equality. Now there is a focus on recognizing the need of special people also. Same goes with justice. There are a lot of principles of justice which we discussed. So that basically tells that these concepts are abstract. That is, their meaning is not final. They are subjective. They are evolving. Their meaning evolves. Even our Supreme Court has evolved their meanings with time, and their meaning will also change as per need of hour in future also. So that's why you should be very open minded while understanding them. You just revise this chapter through this video only, because that video will give you a basic understanding, and you not, as I already said, you do not need to deep dive unnecessarily in this concept. If PSIR is your option, then you should read it. Otherwise, you should just understand these concepts, and that will help you in abstract questions in prelims also, mains also, and in interviews also, right? So this is it from my end. We will cover the remaining sections tomorrow, and thereafter we will complete class 11 polity NCERTs, both NCERTs. Okay, so thank you, students.